Good morning and welcome to Cemeteries and Graves on this grey, dismal morning in February. It's quite an interesting trip, this one is. I won't call it a trip, but a talk looking through it from from early man right up to today. I do apologise for probably omitting your favourite grave or something like that, but I've put the story first rather than the huge range of graves I've got. When I looked through my system folders, is that there were absolutely hundreds of them, so I've had to pick and choose slightly. The one we're looking at here is the Hardwick Grave that dates from, I think, around about 1600. That's in Leeds Minster. It's unusual slightly because I actually painted this onto sandstone, so it's amazing, but it's kept. But we'll see this one right at the end of the talk. So let's have a look at this. I'll have to explain where they all are. This is at Duggleby, which is on the Great Wold Valley, about 2 miles north of Sledmere House. Very easy to see. It's the side of a road as well. A bit of a hedge on one side of it, but the road that runs below it goes to Kirby Grindellive, much easier one to see. And you can say if you're going to walk up to it, walk up from that way because there's a very thick hedge coming down the road from Sledmere down to Duggleby. This is really the oldest burial mound that we have in Yorkshire. It's a Neolithic one. It's just over 4,000 years old, they estimate. It's a round barrow, this one is, because sometimes they have much longer ones as well. But as this is the easiest one to find, I've chosen this one. They call it a how up there, as you can see, because some of them do call them barrows, but it's more of a Norse word, how, meaning man-made mound. As you can see here, it would have stood a lot taller than it was, but it was flattened off to put a windmill on top of it. So it's about 19 feet high at the moment. Some of the other ones stand a bit higher than this, sort of 20 to 25 feet, which is probably what it did from when you look at the drawing of the excavations that took place in the mid-19th century. And so it would have come up like that. So we'll see that there's been various made it much taller over the sort of centuries, I guess, with the sighting of more material on top of it, maybe to make it more obvious. But like I say, in here they found a number of bodies, so there've been sort of 4 crouched adults, which I guess show them in this sort of jumble around there, and there's also an infant being buried in there as well. And in this sort of top layer here, which is showing here, which I guess is one which is nearer the surface, there's been found 50 to 53 further burials, but these are being, or the bodies already being cremated around here. So we're probably looking at a cusp of an age going between the sort of the interments and those which were then cremated. So we've also found other sort of implements in here as well. There's flints, an antler implement, and a bowl as well. So that's really the oldest sort of thing we have. It's survived largely because it's on the Wolds, so it's on chalk. So any water drains all the way through it. If it had been anywhere else in Yorkshire, it would have sort of collapsed itself or been washed away over the millennia. So that's why this has been helped to be saved, and largely because of the winds that come across the I'm going to say dales, across the Wolds as well, has kept it dry from the outside as well. So it's really those two factors that have led into that. So if we go further afield, further west, we come to Stanbury, which is about a couple of miles outside of Harewood. So this is right up on the Pennines. And here we see a different type of funeral, really from the same period as well. This is about 3,860 years ago. So about 200 or 300 years nearer to our times than the one out at Duggleby. And here we see a cremation where it's been put in a jar around here, and it was found on a farm in 2007. So we see that these are some of the other things which have been inside. So this is, if you want to go and see this, this is at Cliff Castle Museum, which stands just outside of Ilkley. It's near the road that goes down the Aire Valley between Keighley and going off towards Skipton as well. It's a fine merchant's house, a wool baron's house, really, that's largely in the French style because he married a French lady. And so it's got all sorts of things in there from the sort of the wider sort of Bradford, Keighley, Skipton areas. That's why this has come up into there as well. So if you're interested in sort of rocks as well, there's plenty of those inside there as well. So all they know from the remains is that the funeral pyre, when the body was burnt, was made of oak and then put inside this urn. And you might think it's a bit funny that it's wider at the bottom, taller and narrower at the top. That's because it's placed how it was found, is that they tipped this upside down for reasons unknown. And it probably also contained items of food to take that person on his journey into the netherworld. So that's at Stanbury. So they use both sort of funerals and bodies. And I've shown you this a couple of times before. And this is the oldest body that we have in Yorkshire. It's called Gristhorpe Man. He was found in the cliffs about a mile and a half north of Filey, so the other side of the Brig, coming up there up to the Scarborough way. The village of Gristhorpe is actually sort of inland, but it's the parish goes right up to the cliff edge. And this was unearthed in 1834. And it's unusual, as we see on this piece of film, is how large this man is. He's over 6 foot tall. And again, he dates back to this same period between sort of 3,500 and 4,000 years ago. So let's have a look at this in the Rotunda Museum, where he is in Scarborough.
But behind me here is a fantastic discovery. This was found 1834. It looks like a lump of wood, but it's actually a coffin lid. This is the coffin lid from a Bronze Age log burial found just down the road at Gristhorpe. Behind you can see one of the original drawings of where it was found, and this was found underneath number 1 on the drawing, with these branches laid over the top, and this is the coffin lid. And what we're going to have a look at now is what they found when they lifted this coffin lid. So when they lifted the coffin lid in 1834, this is what they found underneath, this fantastic, over 6 foot tall skeleton of a Bronze Age log burial, now known as Gristhorpe Man, but he's a fantastic find, and he's been away for the last few years in Bradford, where they've done a lot of work on him to look at his teeth, his dentition, how he lived, a little bit about how he died, and actually it's raised a lot more questions than we have answers. But for instance, we know he was pretty important in his time. He had a very, very good diet. He was buried very elaborately for his time. But the thing that really strikes you is just the sheer size of this guy. He was over 6 foot tall. He was a giant of his time.
So why he was preserved was because of the boulder clay cliffs around there. Obviously, it's lost a lot of the coastline as well. So really, the sort of the boulder clay and other conditions around there has helped to preserve that sort of log coffin around there. It's not very far from Star Car, which dates from around the same period. That's just inland a few more miles more, and stood, this village did, at the edge of the great freshwater lake that went Lake Pickering, that stretched all the way down to Helmsley. So a lot of people living in that area at that time. There would have been part of the Brigantian tribe that covered most of Yorkshire, apart from East Yorkshire, and that's where the Parisi came in. We're looking at some of their chalk figurines which have been found in their burials around that in the Wolds area. They came around 300 BC. They came from the area of Gaul, which was at that time based around Paris, and that's how they got their name and brought it over here. Their capital was at Brough on the north bank of the Humber, and because they could land goods there, and it was the easiest place to cross, I guess, to North Lincolnshire and to go up the river system, up the Ouse and the Aire and other places like that. They had a very different culture from the Brigantians. There are no real Brigantian human remains left, largely because they largely cremated their bodies, or they might have sort of put them in water or whatever, but there's no remains have been found of those. And so that's the difference between the two cultures, really, in terms of burials. And it's known as the Arras culture around here, so named after a very small hamlet near Market Wheaton. And it's thought that these people adopted this culture before they came over to Britain from the Lythe, which were a group of people that were based in Switzerland, who went in for these elaborate burials. And so we see here, these are the chalk figures that were placed they're about 6 inches high, and they were placed in where the local people were interred around here. You can't quite see this on the thing, but the figures here, they have their arms going around the back, and they actually hold a sword behind there, because they're all slightly different. You can see these in the East Riding Museum in Hull. It's a museum in the old time that's free to go in when it eventually opens. So not only were they placing these sort of figures in these interments, but they were also did chariot burials as well, and these ranged over the sort of the area that they live. This is from the furthest west. This chariot burial was found near Ferrybridge Power Station, and it's on display in Castleford Library. They have some Roman remains in there as well. I think there's street posts and things like that they found from the fort around there. Others have been discovered near Wetwang, and because these were really, as you can see in the picture behind, they were like the taxi of the day, or the modern version of a motor car to get around on. So they were just two-wheeled. These wheels then had these iron rims around them as well, and because they pulled by 2 horses. And these, I guess, were to take the person into the next world as fast as they can. And because other chariot burials have been found at Rudston and Scarborough in East Yorkshire as well. But the largest collection had been found most recently in 2018 at Pocklington, where they found 164 burial sites, and because there's other sort of square and round barrows around there as well. Again, it was a 2-wheeled, iron-rimmed wheeled chariot, and this was slightly unusual because both the horses were buried in there, and they still had their the horse harnesses on and things like that. It was also unusual is that the person that was being taken into the next world was actually put in a coffin on where this chap is standing, and because that's probably the most sort of impressive. So I guess it was acting as a hearse in some way. He was buried along with a highly decorated shield and an iron brooch adorned with red glass beads. So these were chieftains that would have had these type of things. So very important people along there. Other ones which might have been more warriors were buried alongside with swords and other things. And again, that's Castleford Library. Just going back to the East Riding Museum, you can see an interment here as well. The Parisi always buried their dead in a crouching position, and grave goods are placed around them as well. You can say similar to that one out at Stanbury is that the Brigantians probably cremated their bodies and then put them in urns as well. So there's a great change because the Parisi traded with the Romans. So it's like a crossover period in the 1st century, but the Romans brought their own culture with them, and these are some graves that we can see in different parts of Yorkshire. Again, there are others in like the Yorkshire Museum in York, but I've chosen these two. This one here was found behind the Black Hat pub. That's kind of difficult to say, opposite the parish church in Ilkley, where the parish church stands was the fortress of that. So it stood very close to it, which is unusual because the Romans, as you can see in this one, these are in the Clifton Park Museum in Rotherham, and because the Romans came up to here in 54 AD, and then really stopped because of the Brigantian tribes facing them across the River Don at the side of sort of Sheffield, and because it was AD 69-70 when they fully invaded right up to the Hadrian's Wall area, pushing back, because they've been beating the Brigantians and pushing them all the way back up into Scotland. And here we have how they're normally displayed is outside the settlement. I think the settlement is meant to be pictured down here because they wouldn't, for again health reasons, wouldn't inter them close to where the fortress was. So they stood on roads which approached those. And again, if you go down to Rome, you can see some of the these types of things along one of the roads just outside of Rome itself, leading southwards. And because they stood this close next to one another. So again, in York, it'd been exactly the same thing. The main road in from the south, from the Leeds end, would all have had these going right along that road leading into up to the fortress, and the crossing over the River Ouse as well, standing outside the colonia, the civil settlement like that. Because that's where they probably come from to be shown inside the Yorkshire Museum. But I've been inside, I think it's a lawyer's property or something like that, because in their basement they actually have a Roman burial underneath there, which is quite unusual. But it shows you that sort of stretch going down towards the naves where they were buried around there. These are quite elaborate ones. The one from Ilkley was dates from around the year 100, and it shows the 30-year-old wife of a Roman soldier. You can see around here she's got long plaited hair coming down over her chest, and because they sits on a high back chair, so it's in that sitting position. It says under here where they depicted out in red, so people aren't sure whether these were coloured in or not, but it might have been assumed so, and this was put on in Victorian times, I guess, to pick out what the lettering it says. It said that she's a Cornovian lady, which meant that she came from the Cheshire, Shropshire area, because they probably came up with a husband who was based in the fort and died up in Ilkley. These, I guess I've mentioned before, slightly from the slightly earlier than the Cornovian lady. So these date from about 70 AD and stretching through to sort of 200 as well, and because they were more put out in the landscape. But it wasn't really a culture that was brought back to local British people. It was sort of more a Roman culture, and I guess some of the people who traded with the Romans and made money from the Romans adopted this culture of having these very ornate and large sculpted tombstones lining the road, but it really wasn't adopted by everyday people at all. Because of the expense, and that locals were probably essentially vassals of the Romans as well. But the Romans left in the early 5th century, and then it really turned back to be sort of the pagan rites that sort of continued on really from Brigantian times, really, of cremations and some burials as well. Here we have two Anglo-Saxon grave covers. They're slightly different. I've chosen these on purpose. This is a flat one here. This is found in Conisbrough Church in South Yorkshire, a very important church, one of the earliest ones as well. And so this dates from probably the 6th, 7th century or something like that, but it's the patterning on it as well, this sort of geometric pattern that I've not seen anywhere else but inside this church, because some of them are just flat stones with a bit of design on. That was laid flat over a burial site, whereas this one, which has come from Adel Church, and this is on display in Leeds City Museum in the city centre. This is thought to date from, I guess, the sort of 7th century, this one around here. That was laid flat, but this was laid upright. So it's more of a grave marker, but sort of the Romans were sort of using the upright ones around that. And also the Christian imagery, especially on this one, of it sort of being a sort of wheel-headed cross as well. And really that was some of the changes that were coming in during this time that we'll see over the next sort of a few hundred years before these Normans invaded in 1066. I'm picking up on one of these sort of unusual stories is that when the Vikings invaded around AD 866, the monks of Lindisfarne, which is just off this map, this map's on display in St Cuthbert's Church at Fishlake near Doncaster, and Fawn, and the M18 that goes down near it, the one that got flooded last year. Because it's just high up off this map, but it was the glare of the lights around here. He lived at St Cuthbert, did 634 to 687. And the monks up on Lindisfarne were worried about the Vikings coming in, burning down the monastery there, and the loss of the body of St Cuthbert himself. They took him on a 7-year-long journey, mostly visiting lands that had been given to him. In Yorkshire, they carried his body around and it rested at a number of places. When we're looking down here, it roughly went Crake, which is, oh, there we are. There's Crake there. Then it came down to the York areas. It was rested on where St Cuthbert's Church is at Peasham Green around there. It came down to Fishlake down here, which I was mentioning about. Ackworth, just below Pontefract, where the Quaker school is there. It divided around all over there, but it came up through Burnsall, and again came to Marske as well, which is just outside Richmond, and into this area sort of on the sort of North Yorkshire Durham border as well. At one time he was reinterred at Ripon Cathedral, as he'd been at the monastery there, founded by Sir St Wilfrid, until the Ionian monks were expelled around 660. Eventually his body was exhumed again and taken up to Durham Cathedral, and that's where his body still lies. It was buried in a grave behind the high altar. That was the most religious part of the building that you could be buried in. But in 1827, the coffin was opened and a skeleton was found inside. It's not the first time that a coffin had been opened. I think it had been opened again around about the 12th century, and it said that the body had been perfectly preserved inside. At this age, they were buried fully clothed in what they wore, and again, objects were from the coffin found in there were removed and are on display in the cathedral itself. The human body was reinterred again until 1899, when it was opened again, and the doctor carried out a post-mortem on the remains. And again, it basically said it was consistent with a body of about sort of 1400 years ago as well. So they are still kept up at Durham Cathedral to this day, and you can see them up there. So it's a rather unusual story of a body being carried around for a large number of years. But when the Vikings invaded in, after AD 866 and took over sort of Yorkshire, they brought their own culture with them as well. And these two hogback tombs, as they're called, are found in different locations. They're mostly found in the North Yorkshire area, and that's where these two come from. This, I'm going to say North Yorkshire, mentioning this one isn't at all. This one is found in Dewsbury Minster, I guess near Wakefield, so quite south of here. The other one I'm showing here, that's in the porch of the church at Helmsley. And you can see they're very different types of hogback tombs around here. They thought that when we talk about the Vikings invaded, it wasn't the Vikings that invaded from the east, but there were Vikings that invaded from the west as well, hopping down the west coast and going to Ireland, and then invading from the west side and coming over and largely settling in the sort of Pennine areas. They're quite I say the Pennine backbone, really, where the living was quite poor around there. So there wasn't really sort of any sort of invasion as such as they would have had coming up the U's and attacking York, whereas these were quite more peaceful ones that came in from the west and just settled because they're settling in areas that weren't farmed at that time. And say this one here at Dewsbury is meant to us, it's shaped like a house. I can say a house of God, really. And I guess it's got a sort of serpent coming down the side, but on top of here, as you can see, it's got like tiling, so that the person under here, I guess it's only the same size as probably a few loaves of bread itself, so it's not very big. As you can see, it just sits on a normal table here. But that was again I guess to protect the body from the elements and things like that. But these other full-size ones, and there's another in Burnsall Church, and I say the biggest collection of them is at Brompton Church, which is just north of Northallerton, and in there you can see 4 of these hogback tombs, and 6 of them have been allowed to be taken out, and they are on display in Durham Cathedral. And basically what they're showing here is a hog, sort of, or sometimes it seems to people think it's a bear lying on its back, and you tend to get its tail curling up at the feet end, and then you can say the clasping round there. Here one, it's slightly different. It's got more of an ornate interlinked sort of pattern on top of there as well. These would have been used to mark again a chieftain or a warrior because of the sheer expense, especially of this one. It looks like it's about, if I remember my foot down there, it's about 6 foot long or longer than that. The one in Burnsall Church is more obviously a hog because you can see its tail at the other end curling round where the feet are. The other thing that this sort of came in for, well, because there was a different types of burials as well, and this was sometimes over the boat burials. Sometimes is that a person would be interred with a small boat and be laid in there, and I guess it's a bit like the previous ones, the chariot burials, is that it would take someone into the afterlife on that boat. Sometimes they had funeral pyres as well, floating the boats down the rivers, burning them alive. That's where this one is. I took this picture at the Viking festival, I think 2009, 2010, that they held in York. They don't do them as ornate as this nowadays. But again, we don't know a great deal about them because they were sort of, apart from the hogback tombs of these other ones, because we only learn about them sometimes through the Icelandic sagas. And that's why we're going to return now and go into the Yorkshire Museum and to see why some of the graves in there and what they actually represent on the side of them, depicted in stone.
So after an incredible period of uncertainty, of sort of battles raging between Anglian elites and kings and the Vikings who came in and tried to take control of the north, we come into a period of sort of relative peace as the Viking infrastructure takes hold, and York becomes Jorvik, which is the Viking capital of the Danelaw, capital of the sort of a massive portion of this country. And we start to see a change in the way that people live and the ideas and influences that sort of shape the city and the way that people do things here. This is a fantastic example of Norse mythology, of the sort of influence of ideas about myths and legends and gods in the Viking period. This incredible object is a grave slab. It comes from York Minster, that's where it was found. And what is detailed on the front of it is a depiction of a Norse myth called the Volsunga Saga. It tells a story of a hero called Sigurd, who is shown here, and basically he fights some dragons, some snakes. You can see those represented all the way along, carved really intricately and really beautifully into the design of this grave slab. They go all the way around the edges and all the way around the back. In the centre we can see Sigurd with his sword running, trying to fight off these snakes, these dragons. And this is sort of a real representation and a real indication of people's beliefs of storytelling, of folklore, of how important a lot of those things that we think of as typically Viking are to people in York during this period and how they take hold. But if we come over here, we'll see that there was also incredible Christian influence in objects as well. So this stone, this dedication slab from York St Mary Castlegate in York, is an incredible find, really. It really sort of shows us that story of how Christianity started to take hold in the Viking period. It's in Latin, and it's laid out like a page in a book, which is a really rare and interesting thing. It basically records the foundation of a minster or parish church in Latin by 2 Viking men. We can actually see their name on the inscription. So Grim and Asa. Really rare to get the names of real people, so it's an incredible find. What this object does really, really well is to show that although in the Viking period people were still very much interested in their earlier pagan gods and they took precedence in many ways, they were still rooted in lots of ways of life, that actually Christianity was really starting to gain popularity and really starting to take hold and take root, and turning religion into something that is much more recognisable to us today. So as well as being a period of emerging Christianity, Viking York is really renowned for its craft industry, for the things that show how people lived and worked and made things in the city. So excavations at places like Coppergate have given us masses and masses of amounts of evidence of industrial work, and the objects, the materials that were being made through that. We have bone, antler, leather, wood, metal, amber, everything you can possibly think of. People in the Viking period were using to make an absolute array of objects and products, from combs to cups to jewellery to leather shoes. Anything you can possibly think of was being made here in York and being used by the people who lived here.
There's a great change in culture again, because they sort of really, the Viking Age, and it really lasted probably a couple of hundred years, really, because the Normans invaded in 1066 and brought a very different culture that sort of swamped the whole of Britain. They sort of became were much more, I'd say, religious and austere about the mood of burials that were taking place, about Judgment Day, sin and punishment. It's something that really, I guess, lasts into the Roman Catholic Church today. They also built lots of churches as well, because at this time prior to this time, again, the interments probably took place in cemeteries, but now the churches were rebuilt in stone, and new ones built in stone as well, and had graveyards attached to them. So that was sort of a bit of a change, because really only sort of monasteries prior to this period would have had graveyards attached to them, whereas to normal people there would have been, I guess, a piece of land outside of a village that would have been used. Like I say, completely changed the culture of this, and because they didn't go in for cremation at all, and the Roman sort of Catholics thought it was sort of desecration of the body, and such a practice was outlawed at the time. But we're coming now to look at this monastic grave covers. This is at Fountains Abbey, and these graves are placed in the chapter house here. This is the sort of burial sites for the abbots and other notables within that. And these not taking place in the Abbey church itself. They weren't allowed to be buried near the altar at all. So this is until after sort of 1345. So of the 38 abbots who were buried at Fountains, 19 were buried in the chapter house, and that's really what we can see around here. The nave to the altar is just to the left of us around here as well. And this is when the graves were now to be founding sort of west to east, sort of head to feet, and it's sort of a culture that actually goes back to sort of pagan times, so pre-Roman times as well. But it seems though that the Christians adapted, like they did a lot of the sort of pagan churches, the holidays and other things like that, and saints' days and things. They sort of enveloped it into the Christian tradition. And so it's believed that the dead will be facing Christ on the day of resurrection. And other people that can be found in abbeys are those people who gave them great gifts. So these could be gifts of land or gifts of money, and that they believed by giving the monasteries these great gifts, they were good deeds on earth would see them through to heaven. And again, often the monks would pray for their souls as well as part of that. And part of this tradition as well is of pilgrims, and this is the body of the place of burial of St John of Beverley at Beverley Minster. And so the founders of these great cathedrals in Yorkshire, St Peter in York, St Wilfrid in Ripon and St John here at Beverley, were, when they died, were buried near to the altars of these great cathedrals. But the only one that's in situ today, as you can see here, is St John of Harpham. And on the 7th of May every year, on the Sunday, or the Sunday closer to that date of his death, is that a service is held here. But it was really to these great cathedrals is that they led pilgrims to come here and to pray at their tombs, and it brought great wealth into the cathedrals as well, and especially when people had sort of gone away and said that it helped them to recover from illnesses. So I guess there's this whole tradition of pilgrims coming in and the towns really growing around them, because they had to provide them with accommodation, food and other things like that. And again, I guess it still continues today. And as part of this is that they might come to see the tomb, but they also come to see relics as well, which were on display. We're looking at two here. This is a part of a piece of bone of St Lawrence, which is on display in Ampleforth Abbey, and the other here is a reliquary that held bones, and is on display in Holy Trinity at Wensley. Because Ampleforth Abbey is a very modern abbey. It was founded in 1806. You can say the first abbey built there by Joseph Hanson in 1857. He was a York architect responsible for a lot of Roman Catholic churches in Yorkshire, as well as the Middleham Suspension Bridge, which unfortunately fell down. He also designed the hansom cab, the taxi of the Victorian period as well. But his abbey was demolished when they constructed a new abbey, which took to build from 1922 through to 1961. And this bone here is said to be a bone of St Lawrence, who was martyred in Rome in 258. He gave away the money rather than handing it over to the authorities, and was roasted alive on a gridiron. It's said to be his arm bone. So that's why people will come to see these relics, bits of the which people said were of the cross, and other types of things like that, because of the holiest of the holy things to find. These were normally kept in a reliquary, which is one of these boxes here. This is thought to come from Easby Abbey, about a mile from Richmond, a bit higher up, well, in the valley higher up the head of Swaledale, whereas it's now on in the Church of Holy Trinity at Wensley. And because this is a 15th century box, and it's probably said to have held the bones of St Agatha, who was the patron saint of the monastery out there. It was later used on, I guess, these bones were destroyed. They're most likely destroyed as either on the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539, but sometimes if they exist further on from that, is that the sort of Puritan parliamentarian army took a dislike to the display of these relics that brought Roman Catholics into these churches and monasteries to see. It was later used as a poor box for the collection of alms for local people around there. So we've heard about these sort of high status people in sort of relating to churches and to abbeys, but the lords of a manor, were also buried in churches. And you say, really, any medieval church you go into in Yorkshire, you will find a burial site of those inside the church. Initially, they were sort of just ground flat graves, which were fairly close to the altar. But when they became to be filled up, is that the people had to be placed elsewhere. And because it was to show the importance of them, now they were sort of carved as statues of themselves in a likeness of themselves. And normally we'll see is that the knight, the lord of a manor, would be to the right of his wife to show the importance of that. However, when we come to look at Nesboro on Wednesday, we'll see that is reversed, that because the wife has been of higher status than the chap she married, which is quite unusual. The knight, if it is so, will have his legs crossed, which gives him the status of his of being a knight. And there'll also be things taken off his coat of arms as well to tell you who he is. And dressed in the style of the day as well as is his wife. They were sort of always put together. This one is from the church in, I'll have to check now. I haven't said where it is now, and I'll let you know next time where this one is. But I had so many to choose from. I chose them because they were fairly obvious in what they were. But a lot of the churches locally have them in. Ilkley Parish Church has a knight in a niche, and others on display as well. So they were sort of, went from the sort of flat graves to be sort of a more sculptured type monuments, and they continued to get grander and grander and grander. So if you go into the likes of Skipton Parish Church, there's huge box tombs there, and coloured in as the way they had this sort of family shields around them as well, and on some of them are depicted the family. But really, before they were made in stone, is that sometimes these effigies were sorry, I'm moving on now from one to the other. So there were lords. So there were the lords of a manor, and there were also other knights, and these were the Templar Knights, and they sort of existed from around about 1170 until they were abolished in 1312. They were a sort of a militaristic religious order, and these were knights that went off to fight the Crusades in the Middle East. In order to support these very expensive campaigns, is that they were given lands in Yorkshire, actually vast quantities of lands as well. And these people are then, if they went on a number of crusades and because they didn't die in Palestine or wherever and came back here, they were buried in the preceptories. This is a preceptory, which is basically a chapel that stood. This one is at is on the side of Pen Hill above Swinnythwaite, and which is, if you know your sort of Wensleydale at all, it's between West Witton and Aysgarth. You can actually park at the end of Swinnythwaite, the Aysgarth end, and there's a track up there. It goes up to Templar Farm, and then this sits on a sort of ledge up there, and you can see here there are 3 grave sites in here as well. So Pen Hill is the one that's really got the preceptory. All the others have gone. That's why if this is a more popular one to go look at, if you look at the Templar Knights. But they had large amounts of lands around Blacktoff on the north bank of the Humber as well. And any names of villages which have got sort of temple in them, Templar stations. So we've got Temple Newsham on the outside of Leeds, and then we've got Templehurst, which is near Drax. And then this is where this one has been found. This is a church called Kellington, not very far from Templehurst. If you're looking around the area, it's virtually where Eggborough Power Station is as well. So it's not unusual to find these Templar Knights in odd locations where you wouldn't consider there would be, because there were, say, smaller preceptories there, which have now gone, and then these have been moved into the more local church around there. So we have sort of lords of a manor, the knights, the monasteries as well. But the only other people that were allowed their own cemeteries were the Jews. And say the Jews seem to have come over. The earliest recording of them officially was in 1130 when there was a Jewish community in York. I guess they've probably been there before. And then sort of in 1177, they were given land for a cemetery, which is next to a road called Dewsbury. It's where Sainsbury's car park is at the end of Lord Mayor's Parade before it goes on to Foss Islands Road. It's sort of on that sort of corner plot round there. Not a very pretty site today. And they might well have shared this grave with other Jewish communities around the place. We'll see here this plaque of being a synagogue at Nesboro as well, in the approximate location of where the marketplace is today. No note exactly where it was, but it was recorded there as well. And so it sort of grew, this sort of Jewish community, because they were allowed to by Henry II. In 1190, the cemetery in York was extended, but it was also the year of a Jewish massacre at the York Castle as well. Things really changed over the next sort of 50 years, really, until 1275, when a statute was issued by King Edward I that required all Jews in the kingdoms to reside only in towns with an archi, which is a Jewish court, where these courts were held. And the only archi in Yorkshire was in York. So it's likely that the synagogue here, as it says here, was dissolved in 1275 and went over to York, because they didn't reside there very long, because in 1290, all Jews were expelled by Edward I. And Jews didn't return or weren't welcomed back into Britain until 1656, when Oliver Cromwell allowed them to return. So that's what you can see. That's the plaque in the car park at Sainsbury's, where the site of the cemetery was. I think they found some Jewish graves in there and placed them, it said here, reinterred elsewhere by Sainsbury's PLC. So that's what that said. So that was really, it just then reverted back to Christian cemeteries after that. So it's rather unusual, and there's one being in York as well. I've shown you the stone sort of effigies that went into churches, but prior to the stone ones is that people bought these off-the-shelf wooden effigies. This is on display in Allerton Mauleverer Church. That's certainly where the A59 goes between Harewood and York, and is near enough at the side of the A1 as you cross over it going from Harewood to York. It's St Martin, and because it was built for the Mauleverer family in probably the 12th or early 13th century. The line of the Mauleverers died out in 1692. These wooden effigies, because they're a lot cheaper to have to buy than us having a stone effigy done. And they were sort of mass produced down in London, and they were fairly easy to transport. You can probably get 10 of these on the back of a cart, and I guess they were sold off the backs of the cart. So they didn't really as much represent the people as in the stone one, because the stonemason put in their particular details onto this, although maybe other bits were added, such as his, again, the knight here with his crossed legs over, it looks like a lion at the bottom there as well, probably from the Mauleverer's coat of arms as well. And again, next to that. But these were sort of, again, light, easy, and a lot cheaper than the other ones as well. It could be transported around. So the next cemetery or grave we have is of a notable, but it's not, again, really of this period, but it sort of goes down in history as being one of the oldest. And whether it took place here or not, no one knows, but it's I guess it helps with the legend. This is the grave site of Robin Hood, which is at Kirklees Priory, and that stands by this near enough by the side where the Dumb Steeple is, on the road between Mirfield and Huddersfield, really just off the M62 as well, if you're coming off the first junction below the service station along there. It's actually on private land, but there is a sort of footpath which I guess is sort of ignored because so many people want to come and have a look at it. It's only about a sort of 5 or 6 minute walk from the Dumb Steeple up to there as well. Robin Hood is supposed to have lived during the 13th century, and his stories were recorded around 1450, and say they were supposed to live at Barnesdale. That's what the sort of the first stories have him located. Barnesdale is on the A1. Say there's some a Barnesdale forest, which probably stretched potentially at that time all the way down to Nottingham. So really sort of following the A1 down from there as well. And say recorded in the Ballad of Robin Hood, stating that. And say the nunnery here, Kirklees Nunnery, was probably founded around 1155, and it's said that Robin died at the treachery at the hands of the Abbess of Kirklees on the 24th of December 1247, and it's said that where he fired an arrow from his deathbed that he was going to be interred, and say that's really what you can see today. I guess it's really is a Victorian folly in a way to give a focus to somewhere to come and have a look. The priory no longer stands. It's really a farm and house around there, and that sort of stands in its grounds. But I guess it gives some people a focus to come and look. And roughly, if legend has it, of where he was actually died. So if we roll forward a century, we come to the we come to the Black Death, and really plagues were a part of I guess the life in the medieval period, and they're really going right on up until the sort of 17th century, when we have the great sort of fire of London, and then the plague as well before that. But really the worst of the plagues was the Black Death that arrived in Yorkshire in 1348 and lasted a number of years. And they said, probably look what we're looking at today, it wasn't just a one-off. It returned in 1360 to 62, and because they returned again in 1374, and the really ones in 1360 to 62 hit children under the age of 10 because they haven't immunity from the plague, and so maybe that's what happened around here today. And it's reckoned that really between a third and half the population was killed at that time. I think it depended on which village, town that you were living in as well. And because as we see on this picture here, is that the slightly difference from there is that the bodies weren't buried individually, but they're thrown into great pits, or they were put on large funeral pyres to get rid of them, because they just didn't have the capability, and then had to get rid of them largely for health reasons as well. And so that's what we see going on. There's no mention really of any plague pits being found in Yorkshire, but quite often there's been sort of plague stones have been kept. I think there's one in the grounds next to the Abbey House Museum, or there was by the door, and there's one on the road between Pontefract and Ackworth, and this is where sort of markets would have taken place. Vinegar would have been put in the plague stone, the coins dropped into the vinegar, and then so the coins taken out, and then the transaction being done after that. But it also led to a different change as well amongst the sort of nobility, they started after this period of building chantry chapels to make sure that, if death did come to them early, is that they will be assured of themselves of a place in heaven. I showed you this last week. This is because not many chantry chapels stand because they were ordered to be demolished in 1547. And I think Scarborough, St Mary's, must have got away with it by converting them into side chapels, or as in here, they made it into a baptistry, because where the font is, where people would be baptized. And so that was probably how it escaped in there as well. And really, that's what sort of came along there. So I guess is that they were building the churches outwards, largely because you wanted to be, until this time, until churches' interiors became too full of graves. And people often did complain about the smell of rotting corpses under the floors. And sometimes that's why the floors sometimes dip and turn, because of obviously when the coffins break down, is that it takes the stone floor above with them. And so that's probably why the chantry chapels were built outwards, because it was a sign of wealth that the founder of these, and I guess there were really mausoleums as well in a small way. I mentioned before that 3 of these chantry chapels in Scarborough, all built outwards at the same time, just I think 1358 I think was the date. So really in the years immediately after the Black Death, there will be a family mausoleum in effect, with their bodies interred in there. Again, these extensions so that they could have space themselves, but they'd also leave a large sum of money for their souls to be prayed, to be saved by the priests being paid for doing that on a daily basis. So we see again another change was in the sort of the ornateness of these tombs, and probably best ones in the country are made of alabaster, are Harewood Church, All Saints, in the just behind the house. That's owned by the Church's Conservation Trust, because they probably isn't open at the moment, but you can go inside, and there's sort of 6 of those inside there, really built between around about 1410 onwards, that we're looking at around here. The importance of this, I guess, it was twofold. One was it was using a sort of a different material. As alabaster isn't found in Yorkshire. The nearest ones are at Newark in sort of Nottinghamshire, and alabaster's found in Derbyshire and further on. So it'd have to be transported up to here. But it's rather like a clay marl type of thing, a sort of a type of gypsum, so that gives it that very sort of clean colour. It also meant that it's very easy to sculpt as well, and that's why I can see so much detail in these tombs around here. And say this was these were built around about sort of 1410, and slightly earlier than that as well, and really again after the Black Death around here. So it's really the detail on these box chest tombs, which again are much more elaborate than those earlier ones, which tend to be just stood off the floor, whereas these box tombs like you see in Skipton Parish Church, I guess, are much more elaborate than that. So the other ones that you can find are in Sheriff Hutton, on the sort of can be found at Sheriff Hutton, fairly close to where the A64 after York goes off. So if you turn left along there, it takes you to Sheriff Hutton. So this church, because it dates back to Anglo-Saxon times, but the northern side chapel was added on in 1447. That's really what we're looking at here. It was built on by Thomas and Alice Bitham. It was probably built on as a chantry chapel as well, and then converted later to a side chapel. So we're looking at is this alabaster tomb here of 10-year-old Edward. He's Richard III's son, who possibly died on the 9th of March 1484. He was both born and died at Middleham Castle. He was probably interred here largely because his mum and father were at Newark Castle, And that's probably why Alabaster was chosen for this tomb and brought up here. It also lay halfway between Middleham Castle and Newark as well, where the royal castle was. And because they probably brought up here, and it was association through his wife that the Edward probably maybe have come down here and was schooled down here by his grandfather or his court down here, who lived in Sheriff Hutton Castle. He died of tuberculosis, and like I say, then his parents, Richard III, travelled, and Anne Neville travelled up here as well. And again, you can see the ornateness of it as well. The sort of the detailing in really the we'll probably call it a skirt, but they probably called it a robe in those days. There's a coronet on his head as well. And so again, a much smaller one, but there's a royal connection with it in Yorkshire. I'm going to say the cost of it, I'm going to say the alabaster. Now, one of the most unusual ones, you might say probably ugliest or scariest of them, is at Lowthorpe. Lowthorpe is between Driffield and Burton Agnes in East Yorkshire. It is just off the road, quite difficult church to find because it's really down a private, it looks like a private drive, but it isn't. It's hidden by a bit of a plantation of trees as well. And a number of things to look at here, because it's sort of coming to this church, you can see three different types of things. Behind here, we've got an Anglo-Saxon cross here that will date back to the 7th or 8th century, so showing how old this church is. And then this is the Heselton monument down here as well. This is sort of, it's got the body of a man and wife, probably Sir Thomas Heselton and his wife Alice. They founded a chantry chapel here in 1364. What's unusual about it, it's quite hard to photograph, is that you got a sort of a conjoined central spine coming down here, shared between man and wife, and depictions, which you can see over here, of their 13 children who are represented just by heads coming off that. So sort of a particularly gruesome in a way, and quite odd for a grave. If you're also in this church as well, you can see some church brasses as well, which are quite rare today, largely because a lot of them have been stolen. But again, there was a sign that you could afford to have a brass made and inlaid onto that. So that's why you see a lot of the flat tombstones in the churches without them, because again, they've probably been stolen sometime probably from the dissolution of the abbeys, but more likely by the Puritan parliamentarians who took exception against these, I guess, personal artifacts relating to the family, and maybe because they were high status family, and they sort of construed it as all to do with Roman Catholicism, which it did do, because there wasn't any other religion besides Roman Catholics up until the founding of the Church of England by Henry VIII in 1534. So I'm not quite sure what they expected these things to do, but to us, it's a great loss. And this one over here, these are original brasses which have come off and on display. But this one over here is a replica. This was the original was stolen, but was recovered in Howden, again in East Yorkshire, and rather than put it on display again for it to be stolen, is that they've made a replica of it and put it on the wall. I think I've been into that church I mentioned before at Bransburton, I showed the other week, where there's an old market cross in there, and there's a Victorian postcard of the flat tomb fairly close to the altar that had a brass on it, and the postcard I think is dated around about 1900. The following postcard, I think dated before World War I, shows it without the brass on it. So it's not just a sort of thing that happened by the Puritans, but it's also thefts which have continued today in churches ever since, taking stone or whatever it is that can be lifted. But it's a great shame that, because it's really sort of part of the social history of an area which has disappeared along with it. And it was really about this time in the sort of 15th century that they started tolling the bell for a death. And it really first started off with tolling the bell when somebody was actually dying, which mustn't have been very good for them if they could hear it on their deathbed. And then again, it will be tolled during the funeral that would have taken place. Funerals in those days of high status people would have lasted a number of days as well. So there have been processions and things like that. And maybe is that people were forced into joining those processions to swell the numbers as well, maybe to make that person look more popular, because these processions might have vied with one another from village to village or town to town to show you who was the most popular or who was the most benevolent or whatever. And it's a custom that we'll see on Wednesday that was to be cut short by an act to stop doing that until, I guess, it came into being again. And so we see then coming up to where we're ending today, just a couple more slides, is that really coming up to the time of Henry VIII, because they obviously establishing the Church of England in 1534. In 1538, he told every church to keep a register of births, marriages and deaths as well. And every parson, vicar or curate to record every wedding, christening and burial in his parish. And the parish was to pay for a parish chest, which would have 2 locks, some have 3 locks on, the key held by the vicar or the parson and the other by the church warden, and that these registers were to be deposited into this chest. The entries were to be made every Sunday in the presence of one of the wardens. And if they didn't do it, someone from the bishop would come round to check that they were being kept. And if they weren't being kept, they would be fined. I guess it was probably more of a religious court type aspect, because the fine would then be split between the repair of a church and for the alms for the poor people as well. And again, it sort of led to some sort of attacks on churches. Sorry, I just lost my page. I must have printed it out twice there. Really largely through Thomas Cromwell. He was appointed Henry's Vicar General, and his power was over and above that of the bishops. And because he then had the power to promote people who had more Protestant sympathies than the sort of people had religious, Roman Catholic sympathies. And at that time, feast days were abandoned, pilgrimages were banned, and Bibles in both English and Latin had to be placed in all churches, because they're the only authorised one being the Coverdale Bible after 1535. As I mentioned earlier, the Chantries Act of 1547 saw the demolition of these chantries and for the praying of the souls of those interred there. It also stopped the bell ringing in churches for the dying and at burials, but like I say, it was hard to stamp out that practice, and it seemed to a blind eye was taken to it from the 1590s, sort of after that time. I can say the long Roman Catholic tradition was much sort of harder to shake off in Yorkshire because of the sort of the nobility, because they remaining staunch Roman Catholics, as we've seen through the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. But the very long sort of Catholic services that were held over many days were cut short when in 1552 the Book of Common Prayer had to be adhered to, and that burials now had to take place just in one day. And because as part of this is that the call for less elaborate burial rites and none of these huge processions that had sort of grown in the sort of 14th and 15th centuries. And here now the funeral would be led by the priest into the church. He would perform, because they'd be religious duties, and afterwards accompany the corpse into the churchyard, saying certain texts which he was allowed to say through that Book of Common Prayer as well. And so that was all sort of prescribed how it would take place now. And these great processions then stopped, but only for a short while. And I guess it was really the state processions of the death of probably something like Elizabeth I that people probably saw it as a sign, is that it was all right for the nobility to have these much greater processions as well. And they sort of restarted. So that's where I'm going to end today.